Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the show. I'm very excited today to be joined by not one, but two special guests. Michael Foster, who is the pastor of East River Church in Batavia, Ohio. I keep wanting to say Batavia, Illinois, because I lived in Chicago a long time, and there's a suburb there called Batavia. But it's an eastern suburb of Cincinnati. And then also... I keep wanting to say Batavia, Illinois, because I lived in... And also Dominic Tennant, who goes by the name Bnonn, who runs a marketing agency in New Zealand. And he and Michael are the authors of the soon-to-be-released book, It's Good to Be a Man, on Canon Press. And so they were gracious enough to join me today to talk about their book and their It's Good to Be a Man project, which was actually ongoing for several years before they turned it into a book. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining me.
Happy to be here.
Yep, it's great to be here. Thanks, Aaron.
Bnonn, what time is it in New Zealand?
It is 9:10 in the morning.
Oh, okay. So we're not doing this in the middle of the night or anything. So when I toss you those zingers, if you flub them, it's not because you didn't get enough sleep.
It's just because I'm an idiot.
How did you guys meet? If one of you's in New Zealand and the other one is in Ohio?
Through the power of the interwebs.
I think we've kind of been into some of the same internet subculture for a while. Just kind of different theological controversies that we're interested in. So many that we don't even talk about anymore. That Bnonn was writing about. I had an interest in Genesis 6 and the sons of God there, and what that passage meant. I wrote a paper on it, a few papers on it in seminary. And Bnonn and I have different positions on it. They kind of overlap these days, but and that's, I think we interacted there and a few other places. And then when I started researching kind of the red pill manosphere masculinity space, I wrote something and someone Bnonn commented, or someone pointed me to something Bnonn had written, and I realized that we were reading a lot of the same authors. Mm-hmm. And so we started to interact about it a little more purposefully. And then
he thought we were reading the same authors. I wasn't reading anything that he thought I was reading.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, nonetheless, when I started doing It's Good to Be a Man, it was a solo project, but I like to work with other people. I like to collaborate as much as possible. I find that projects that have at least one other partner really, one, they have a little more character because it's a combination of two people working on something, but they also tend to last longer and have more influence. So I was looking for someone in the back of my mind that I could work with on It's Good to Be a Man. So I think I had been doing it for maybe a month, 6 weeks, maybe 2 months, when I asked Bnonn if he would come on and be a collaborator and share content and help move it towards something helpful for other men. And he did. And that's kind of how it started.
Right. How did you guys get interested in men's issues? Michael, you just mentioned that you found red pill literature. I don't know if that was your intro point, or I'd be interested in how each of you got to start engaging on kind of men's issues in a different way.
Why don't you go first, Bnonn?
Yeah, well, for my part, it was a weird circuitous route to get there. I was involved with a lot of, if you look at my blog, a lot of fairly abstruse theology, and was working through a lot of biblical theology around kingdom, and kind of accidentally stumbled onto a blog called Del Rock, who many of your viewers probably know, and ended up reading a great deal of that content. And I was thinking a lot about the implications of kingdom theology, the way that kingdom is expressed in scripture, and the fact that we have a king and all that kind of thing, thinking a lot about the implication of that for gender roles. And Del Rock was like a big red pill moment for me. And I had, very much like most people, I had kind of a red pill cage stage. And Michael was the one that helped me to get through that. And the vision that he had of a positive doctrine of masculinity for men, something that's really practical and actually puts men in the right position to be leading their houses and doing the work that God gave them, was very appealing to me, because I realized at that time that's what I really need, because I'm stuck in this rut of kind of resentment and just wanting to rage against feminism. And that's completely unhelpful and not really the scriptural model.
No, no. I think what you're describing there is kind of a normal trajectory for a lot of guys, and that you kind of discover these sites, Dow Rock or someone else, and you devour it, and you're like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of things I don't like about these people, maybe, but they're right on a lot of stuff. And you can feel like when you feel like you've been lied to by society, maybe by your church, and you realize that you've kind of given your life maybe to the service of a lie in some respects, you do kind of go through this rage phase, as I think as some people call it. I guess I never really did that, but I see that it happened to a lot of people. It happened to a lot of people. What about you, Michael?
I'm a little unique how I came into it. Is that a lot of people kind of come into that content trying to solve a problem. But usually that problem's relatively personal, their own marriage, their relationship to women in the dating courtship market, whatever. My problem was trying to help people in those situations. Like I actually was in a really healthy, good marriage, still am. And I was finding the young men I was trying to counsel and help would do that whole kind of dog thing, like like you say that, but that does not resonate with my experience with the things I'm going through. And so your automatic default for almost everybody is to assume that someone's just lying or they're full of it or they're not listening, because so often men are. They're making excuses and they're not getting it done, not because they're doing the wrong thing, but because of a lack of effort. But it got to the point where so many men of so many different qualities and statuses and experiences were saying the same thing that I thought, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's something I'm missing. And I asked who they found helpful, and they were pointing me to, there's like Joe Rogan or whatever. But then there was guys like Jordan Peterson. And then they pointed me to fellows like Rollo Tomasi, who I'd never heard of. And I started to digest large quantities of this content out of a desire to understand, why are Christian men going to quasi-Christian or non-Christian sources trying to sort out their issues with their own manhood and sexuality in general. So at the time, I was part-time director in a PCA church, and I had my own business where I sold mixed media, where I have to pack things. When I'd pack things for about 20 hours a week, I listened to MRAs, right, men's rights activists, both like the guys like Paul Elam or Karen Strawn, who's a anti-feminist. Then I listened to Rollo Tomasi's book on Audible. I listened to hundreds of hours of Peterson's lectures. I started listening to pickup artists, because a lot of them were recommended, and dating coaches. And so a pickup artist is more about helping you have a short-term sexual strategy. In other words, to get a woman in bed with very little focus on having a relationship, where a dating coach is usually trying to help you generate a relationship with the opposite sex. So I started listening to all this stuff, and there was things that just seemed stupid to me. I do remember that there was this dating coach that said, hey, if you do this, this will make a woman more flirty and all this. And I was like, no, that's stupid. That won't work. And then I thought to myself, well, let's test it out on my wife and see what happens. Right. And so then I go and play around with my wife that way. And lo and behold, it worked. And so I think it helped me understand a little bit of the questions these guys had, the issues they were facing, in that it wasn't just that the church wasn't speaking to the issue, because the church was, but it was kind of old answers, like for a different world. And a lot of times it wasn't even good for that old world. But they also were saying things that had been neglected in the church for a long time. And I had a love of anthropology, of human anthropology, because I studied it. I started out as an anthropology student at Northern Kentucky University and took a lot of sociology classes. And then I also read a lot of the early church fathers, who were very much concerned with the human body and incarnated living and all that sort of stuff. I started to recognize that these guys had rediscovered some creational realities from the design of God that were very helpful and had been lost in large part to our Gnostic tendencies in this culture, where we act like there's the spirit and the body and they don't interact, and the spirit's what really matters. And so the church hasn't had good answers for a lot of the issues that we face. And so that I got into the red pill world that way. I've been on Twitter for years, but I always thought Twitter was gay. That always got me in trouble. And I'd always go on Twitter and like tweet the bones of the body or prime numbers, because I just thought it was just meaningless factoids disconnected from context. But I realized that the young men were on Reddit, to some degree, 4chan, YouTube, and Twitter. So I started to peruse all those a little bit to understand them, but I got real active on Twitter, and that eventually put me on the radar of a lot of the people in the manosphere who I've since become acquaintances with, and in many cases become friends. Even the non-Christian men in the manosphere have become, some of them, really good acquaintances and friends. So that's how I got into it.
Yeah. I discovered the red pill world. I remember exactly how it was. There was a link to a site called Return of Kings.
Yeah.
Return of Kings was like a lad magazine, online lad magazine that was run by a guy named Rush Velizadeh, who at that time was one of the world's most famous pickup artists. And, it was linked on Instapundit, which is kind of a mainstream conservative link aggregator. And I just saw this link and I clicked on it and I read the article. And there must have been something about it was a fun, I don't remember exactly what article it was, but it was funny. And something about it must have rang true, because I started clicking through Return of Kings, which had been in business about a year at that time. And I just drained the entire thing and just kind of like going into like a Wikipedia rat hole and checking it out. And I kind of wanted to go back and find out exactly what the article was, because I remember the month. It was October 2013, and I can't find the link on the site anywhere, even when I do view source. So obviously Reynolds and them went back and scrubbed their site after somebody told them they shouldn't be linking to Roosh or whatever anymore. Things like that have a tendency of disappearing, but that's kind of how I found it. And there are all these stories about how people find this stuff, and it is very interesting. It is interesting, colorful material. Let's just say colorful material, something that would certainly shock the more kind of prim and proper Southern Baptist in this world. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Well, what made you decide to start a, kind of a Christian men's ministry, if you wanted to call it that, called It's Good to Be a Man?
So the way it started with me is I've been interested in sexuality kind of from an academic and theological level since I was 19. So I've been reading Betty Friedan, Shulamith Firestone, E. Michael Jones, like every side of this for since I was 19. E. Michael Jones early on is kind of funny. I'm ethnically Jewish.
Yeah, he's got a little bit of a Jew problem, I think.
So, but he was fascinating in the things that he said, and I read a lot of guys like that. I read very widely, and was very interested in androgyny from an early on age. Where that started was an anthropology class. I had a lesbian feminist, it was sociology prof that was talking about how they sold women's purses and makeup to men because they already had created the factory lines and they had maxed out the female market, and they're looking for a way to increase their profits, and how they normalized like different types of hair gel for men just because they wanted to sell more. That was very interesting to me. And I remember another class where these African tribes people had been showed this greased up black bodybuilder. It was all like huge muscles, and they showed it to the tribes people, and they're like, "That is one huge woman," And just everything around sexuality, because I was reading like Clement and Origen and a lot of those early church fathers, they were very concerned about the physical, about fluids and touching and hair and all that stuff. And Christians weren't talking about this. So I've been interested in that in a long time. And I read Doug Wilson early in my marriage and some other guys in that space as well. But all that stuff wasn't helpful to young men that I knew that were trying to get married and navigate that. And I was running, and I'd run this 2-mile loop, and the mile marker ended at this house that was owned by the Goodmans. I don't know the Goodmans, but that's their house. So I'd stop there and I'd do the whole take a breather before I'm going to get finished. And then I'd always like, yeah, it's good to be a man. I'd say that every time I saw that mailbox. And I was like, man, that's kind of catchy. So then I thought, someone should do a podcast that engages these issues that these guys are struggling with, like a podcast or some sort of website or whatever. So that's where I started the idea. And it really kind of took on a life of its own. And when Bnonn joined the project, he brought a whole new energy and perspective to it. So what I kind of love about It's Good to Be a Man, actually what I love most about it, is that it really is a product of fraternity, like two men coming together, trying to solve issues for each other and for men that we care about. And it was funny, the first manuscript of the book, I think, was more me than it was Bnonn by and large. And then I got quite ill this past summer, and Bnonn had to kind of drag us over into the end zone on the second manuscript that Canon wanted. And then when I read it, it's funny, like every sentence is some me, some Bnonn, and where one ends and one begins, I don't know. And I think, to me, that's no matter how many copies it sells, it's like a victory. Like we practiced what we preached. We came together, we had a mission, and we made this thing. We produced it for other guys out of a desire to help other men and protect, provide, and lead. And so that's been the project. And we did it to help guys. We did it to help ourselves. We did it to glorify God. And now we finished it in the book, and we'll see what's next in the next year.
Yeah, I have never done a collaborative writing project with someone. I've definitely worked with a lot of editors over the years, and even working with editors can be challenging sometimes, although I don't mind being edited. But
working with editors was way more challenging for us than working with each other.
Trying to like truly have collaborative, because I'm so particular about my writing. It must have been a I don't know what kind of experience. Had either of you guys ever done collaborative writing before?
Yeah, I had. Because I've done just an enormous amount of writing in general.
Yeah. I worked in marketing, and so a lot of times what I do is I sketch out things, and then I hand them over to people to fill them in and to finish them out, and I just move on with my life. So that's been a large part of what I've done. I think it's probably why I'm pretty good at Twitter and at social media, is that I'm good at coming up with phrases and catchy things and then handing them off to someone to fill them in. So.
And on the other side of the coin, what I do for my day job is basically taking stuff that other people have created as seed content and turning it into proper marketing material. So that worked out pretty well.
Yeah. Now, when I started the Masculinist newsletter back in 2016, I really, the truth be told, didn't want to do it. I had done a lot of study, over the course of the last couple of years prior to that. And really, what I really wanted to find was a pastor who was working on this that I could kind of turn this material over to and let him do it, because I really didn't want to do it. And had I found someone really engaged in the space of sort of the reform of gender teaching in the evangelical church, I never would have started this project. I had the idea. What I really wanted to do was start a website devoted to sort of microbiome issues, because I thought that was becoming big, and I thought it would be like a great money-making opportunity, candidly. Which, starting a, newsletter about masculinity in church just was not that at the time, for sure. And, but I felt like I know this stuff, so I have to do it because there's nobody else there. And then later, I think you guys started maybe after I did, or around the same time. There's bigger community. And if I'd known about guys like Alistair Roberts, maybe I would have stopped, in advance. But I guess I'm glad on that. And I found out a few more people later. But I felt like there was sort of an obligation to do something, because, nobody was really talking about these issues in the church. And all these guys are turning to, again, the pickup artists or the alt-right. And, that's not really the best place for them to be turning, let's be honest. But you talked about the name, It's Good to Be a Man. And that's kind of an interesting name. I don't know if you remember this 4chan meme from a few years ago. They started printing out these pieces of paper that just says in sort of a Arial font, "It's okay to be white," and posting them on campuses. And it was sort of a rhetorical kill shot, because they're not really saying there's anything particularly good about being white. They're just saying, hey, it's okay to be white. And it just caused this massive uproar, on his campuses. And I would think, it's good to be a man. You wouldn't think that would be a controversial title, but has it been controversial?
What do you think, Nunn?
Well, there is a certain subset of people, and it's either white knights or feminist women who will assume that when you make a statement about men, you must be actually making a statement about women. So if you say it's good to be a man, what you're really saying is, it's like a dog whistle. What you're really saying is, it's actually bad to be a woman. So it has been controversial in that sense. But I think that for the audience that we're actually aiming at, it's been kind of the opposite of controversial, in the sense that men really need other men to be saying simple truths like that, which they've just spent their entire lives having hammered into them that it's not good to be a man. And it's false. It is. And they just need to hear that. It's encouragement.
There's a flip side to that too that was kind of interesting in the very early days of the project, which is there's a project called the Good Man Project. And so kind of in the Christian manosphere, like Dalrock wrote about us a little bit before he retired, and he was trying to figure out like where we were at, right? And a lot of people took it to be the Good Man Project, where a good man does this or that, right? Be a man. Be a man means do what women want you, or always be nice, right? And so, but our project's not the Good Man Project. It's good to be a man. In other words, manhood, maleness, which is created by God, is in essence good. Just like food is good and mountains are good, and anything that God has designed as part of his cosmos, the structure of creation, is in of itself good. And that's exactly
except for cats.
Except cats, yeah. Cats are
my wife would agree with you on that about the cats.
She allergic to them?
Yeah, Dalrock had a lot of influence on what I did. I learned a lot from him. And I thought he was really spectacular at like analyzing Christian media product and picking it apart like piece by piece and explaining what they're doing with it. And so there's a lot of like, maybe positive things that came out of it, but I also had some kind of, call it negative inspiration from Dalrock. Yeah. And one of them was, he was relentlessly negative, and he essentially attacked everyone who was operating with a real name in the real world and said they were somehow a sellout. He attacked Tim Bailey. He attacks Doug Wilson. He attacks you. It's like a little bit of projection. He used to talk about how preachers like Mark Driscoll used to use the only real man in the room tactic, or the alpha male of the group tactic. Yeah, where I'm the only real man. He sort of had that. He's the only true teacher. Everybody else is sort of a fake, and that was sort of one of his shticks, which is unfortunate because it didn't need to be that way.
He didn't really, and just to be fair to Dal, he didn't directly attack us, I don't think, ever. I think he raised some concerns. It was more like the Dalbots is what we call them. It's like Rolo has Rolobots, these people that just are fanboys. Mm-hmm. But we interacted with them via email because he actually reached out to me once by email, like, hey, is there a problem between us? And so I engaged with them. And what we basically told them was that, look, you're good at what you do. You're kind of like a guy that studies cancer. And the cancer of feminism, the cancer of egalitarianism, all the stuff in the church, you understand it more than most do. But we're looking for a cure, right? And so we benefit from you, and really don't think we should be fighting amongst each other. I always try to maintain peace wherever I can, and I feel like we ended that relationship on a pleasant note, I guess, or agreeable note, but you do need answers. And the answer can't, so guys like Dalrock didn't provide good answers. I don't think Rollo Tomasi does either. They all say, hey, I have everything that you want, but you can't have it. Sorry, the world's messed.
It's interesting. I don't want to get down a rabbit hole in this, but I always noticed a parallel between Rollo and Dalrock. And that they both had, and of course they had a bromance with each other. Mm-hmm. But they had this idea that, the kind of a nihilistic approach. The world is so toxic, women are so bad, nobody could ever have, a good, healthy marriage. And yet both of them claimed to be married to smoking hot wives who loved them, who never did any of this stuff, to have amazing kids, amazing families. It's like, I can have this, you can never have that. And I think Driscoll did a little bit of that too, when he kind of talked about Grace and his kids. And I just really, man, what's the connection here that Rollo and Dalrock both seem to have a similar exact kind of motif in that way?
I think a lot of people thought it was the same person for a while.
Yeah,
you're right. I don't know. Nam, what do you think? We've talked. It's been years since we talked about it because we stopped playing about them. They kind of became irrelevant for reasons.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that there's something about it that attracts men of a particular kind, and the Delbots are all they all come across as really gamma. They spend a lot of their time just writing screeds of content, and they're very aggressive online. I think that they're attracted to what they don't have, and so there's a kind of weird parasitic relationship whereby telling them that you've got the thing but they can't have it, it's like it increases their need and their reliance on you. I'm not really even sure how it works.
Well, I want to be clear too. Whatever the quirks of Dalrock, he was the pioneer of this space.
Yeah, from
a Christian perspective, I think in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
And
a
lot of his early work was almost sort of like Brad Wilcoxian in the sense that it was very statistical. He's always pouring out charts and graphs from the Census Bureau, and a lot of interesting stuff there. Michael, you mentioned Twitter, and you guys, or certainly you, Michael, have been very active on Twitter and have managed to generate some controversy. And you get a lot of great quips. Like one of the quips from the book was, "Men's ministries are just women's ministries with bacon." And I really thought that's a great tweet right there. I almost want to steal that. I almost tweeted that myself, but I'm like, we'll save it for the thing. And you got in big trouble one time for a tweet. I was going to go one little tweet that we talk about, which was, you talk about guys who are dating a single mothers, and basically just made the point, before you marry her, I don't remember exactly what you said, but something like this, just ask yourself, why is she a single mother? It wasn't even like negative. It's kind of like, well, how did this come about? And that the torrents of hate that came, what happened to you when you said that?
Well, I kind of knew there would be pushback, because I had a lot of people say, well, you knew that was going to happen. Well, I knew there was going to be pushback. I didn't know it was going to be in USA Today and Allie Beth Stuckey trying to dunk on me. And it was crazy. The number of blue checks that got involved in that thing was next level. I still have thousands of emails I've never even read from that. They tried to get me fired from my job and all this. And my former church asked me to remove from my Facebook that I was employed by them. I just had forgotten to take it off. So I was like, that's fine. I wasn't meaning to cause you trouble. But I thought, you know what? Here's what people got the maddest about, I think, is that I would not apologize. And I'm like, I'm not sorry. It's absolutely true. I'll say it again. And every once in a while, I'll retweet it just for the heck of it, because it's like, you know what? This is stupid. Everyone knows this. Everyone knows that. Well, why did you say it about single dads? Because I didn't. And I could. Well, could you? Yes. And then they don't know what to say. Like, well, I don't have to say, it's not like, here's one thing wrong with women, here's one thing wrong with men, back and forth. I'm not going to do that. And I think what it does, it strikes at the heart of everything that's wrong with our culture, which is the brokenness of the family. First off, a single mom, the fatherlessness, a child without a dad, and then applying standards to a woman. In other words, that women have accountability, right? And that men shouldn't just accept whatever comes their way, that they should actually have some filters and think about it. And the basic idea in the culture is men should be happy that any woman pays attention to them. And so it was kind of on accident. I wasn't meaning to do this. It just hit every nerve from lots of different directions. And And then the pushback, it helped my Twitter grow immensely. I don't know.
I'm sure.
Like 2,000 or 3,000 followers. And it opened a lot of doors for me. It's same like that American Airlines one that I had. I get one that goes viral. It seems like about every 6 months or so that goes real big. But yeah, I've never apologized for it, and I don't. If you're dating someone that's got a single mother out there or single with kids, something went wrong somewhere. Find out why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that reminded me of a similar firestorm that happened. This Korean pastor from Queens, he just had a little small blog, and he wrote 2 articles, one called 10 Men Christian Women Should Not Marry, and then he wrote another one called 10 Women Christian Men Should Not Marry. And I guess which one got picked up and went nuclear viral. And like Richard Dawkins was talking about it, and the Houston Chronicle was writing about it. It became like a global international incident. And my style is not like that at all. One of the things that I do is I essentially almost never talk about or react to any of what the different female Christian writers are doing, because it's just that's not where I'm playing. I'm kind of just focusing on men and what I'm doing. But you can't say even the most innocuous statement you could just get pilloried for at any time. You never know when when your lucky lottery number is going to come up. I was really struck. You probably remember back. I think it was in 2015. There was a debate in a presidential primary, Republican presidential primary, and somebody asked Trump if a woman who has an abortion should be punished. Yeah. And this is when he was not really pro-life, because you could just see the gears spinning in his head. He's like, well, abortion is murder. I oppose abortion. So I guess the answer is yes. And of course, he got a torrent of hate. Yep. And the National Right to Life issued a press release that literally said women who procure abortions are victims. Not even that they shouldn't be punished or that would be unwise or anything of that nature, but literally it was just women who procure abortions are victims. And I just thought that was really, really interesting, and that there seems to be in the church community a complete inability or unwillingness to admit that women ever sin or do anything wrong.
Yeah, there's a particular kind of boomer mindset there as well that we've noticed. It seems to be especially common among boomer pastors that they would have this attitude that women can't sin, or if women do sin, it's primarily because of some victimhood rather than because of some sin issue. You even see, I'm very, very wary of criticizing Doug Wilson, but at one point I took him to task because he said something very along those lines, specifically about abortion. I was like, no, have you talked to women outside abortion clinics? They're not victims. They know what they're doing.
Yeah. So I want to dive into the book. And first, I guess before we start that, I'll just pause for a minute to remind our audience that I'm here with Michael Foster and Bnonn Tennant talking about their book, which is imminently about to be released from Canon Press, called "It's Good to Be a Man." And you can also just Google that, and you'll find them anywhere on Twitter, social media. Sign up for their newsletter, etc. And if you haven't done so yet, if you're on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit like, and if you're listening to this on podcast, please leave a rating on Apple Podcasts. Really appreciate it. So, what is the core fundamental thesis of "It's Good to Be a Man," the book?
The core fundamental thesis,
or is that too simplistic? Is that too simplistic of it?
I don't think it's too simplistic. It's just that we never really, I don't think we ever actually worked it out in exactly those terms before.
As the man goes, so goes the household. As the household goes, so goes society. So society is in disrepair because there's been an attack on masculinity. That attack on masculinity is not just feminist, but ultimately spiritual in nature, because the devil attacks the leaders. Just like Pharaoh has the firstborn sons of Egypt killed because they're the future heads of household, and they present a threat to his rule and reign. So does the devil go after men, young men in particular, when they're vulnerable. And so our book was like, why is there an attack on men? what areas of masculinity do they attack? Namely, male sex drive, ambition, a desire to build, a want for fraternity. These things have been demonized, but they're actually good gifts from God and part of our design. Men should want to be fruitful and multiply. Men should want other men to work with and fight with and build with. Men should be driven to make something. Ambition, when reordered, is good. And so we wanted to lay out a book that explains why, from a spiritual standpoint, men are under attack, and how can you regain your masculinity, biblically speaking, in a situation like ours. I would say that's the big idea.
Yeah, that's kind of what ties everything together. But in a sense, I would say that each chapter has its own thesis. So it's almost like a series of essays which we connected together around a common thread. So each chapter looks at a specific issue that's related to that common thread, but they can be quite diverse in what each of their theses would be.
Yeah, because one of your first chapters is called The War on Patriarchies, or The War of Patriarchies. What is the War of Patriarchies?
Essentially, it's the war. It's taking the facts on the ground and saying what's going on, what is motivating this strange antipathy towards men that we see in the modern culture, and taking it back to scripture and looking at, from the beginning, how mankind is separated into two theologically opposite groups. You've got the seed of the woman and you've got the seed of the serpent. And these groups are at loggerheads throughout history. They are warring throughout history. And all of the individual men that you see, and even women who are often behind them, that you see in scripture, who are working against God's people, working against God's design, they are doing the will of their father, the devil, as Jesus says in John 8:44. And all of the men who are working to further God's design, to establish his kingdom, are sons of God doing the will of their father. So there are two fathers, two spiritual fathers, out of which all of the conflict on earth arises, because when you have a son is someone who does what you do. A son is someone who looks like you, who has a family resemblance to you. And the theological family resemblance is either going to be to the serpent or to God, and that's going to cause an ongoing conflict throughout history.
Why it becomes an issue, too, is usually this conversation is presented as a war between the sexes, or between the genders, men and women, where obviously they were made to work together and to complement one another. It's not good that a man be alone. In other words, mankind cannot complete the creation mandate, the command to be fruitful and multiply, rule, reign, subdue, have dominion on the earth. That requires he's not asexual. He can't cut off his finger and make a new person. But it's beyond just the ability to through coitus to have a child, but actually to raise a child and to conquer and refine and all that, everything. And that's why the creation mandate is often called the cultural mandate, because culture comes from that. So we wanted to show, like, no, it's not. There is such thing as an evil patriarchy. And you have to believe that. It's interesting when you listen to some of the men's rights activists, even some of the guys in kind of the world of the red pill, the Rollo types, where they'll talk about the feminine imperative. And it's kind of like it's their version of the patriarchy that's holding them down, right? And the thing is, if men...
Well, Rollo does believe there's a war of the sexes.
He does,
I think,
absolutely.
Yeah, he says, absolutely. Like, for one's sex's reproductive, strategies to succeed, the other one basically has to fail.
Yeah, it's a zero-sum game.
It's a zero. And ultimately, there's competition between sexual strategies of men and women is one of his theses.
And so aspect of his research and things is true, but it's ultimately framed in a non-biblical, nihilistic worldview that really is purely informed from a pop culture understanding of evolutionary psychology, borrowed from the remnants of old chat rooms. We're on. That's what's happened. But what our point is that if women are more powerful than men, how exactly did they wrestle? Or if men are more powerful than women, how exactly did women wrestle authority away? Well, either men gave it away, or men removed it from some men and put women in that place, because they're more compliant and easy to manage. And so you do have male leaders are still at the top in most every country, every corporation, like not talking 90% or more. And so what we see at a spiritual level is a battle between the patriarchies, and even our current situation, our problem is still there's ungodly men that need to be reordered according to God's design. And so there is a spiritual battle going on between men. Our biggest enemy isn't women. Women are kind of being used, I think, by and large, by these forces. Peterson talks about this with women in middle management, that why they promote them, because they're more compliant and easy to manage.
Yeah, I would certainly say women are not being well served by today's world. I mean, if you look at the unhappiness figures and the use of antidepressants and on down the line, just because I say men are not doing well doesn't mean women are actually doing well. I think it's been a lose-lose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Quite frankly, because if you look at it, again, nobody. I always use the example of the incel. Everybody, nobody feels sorry for these male incels, but every man who cannot get a date or can't get married means there's a woman who's not going to get married and can't get a date. Basically, maybe they could have sex, in a sense, but they're not going to get married because it takes two, right? And so there's a symmetry there between the outcomes, I think, of the sexes, in terms of how it works. The patriarchy? Are you one of these people, or two of these people, who subscribe to the patriarchy is inevitable thesis?
100%. Patriarchy is completely inevitable because God made Adam the head, not Eve, and that's a pattern which is. Essentially that's a seed. One of the things that we talk about somewhat obliquely in our book, but a principle which is really important in our work is that everything is in Genesis, and that Genesis is the seed out of which everything grows. And the patterns that are established in Genesis are like seeds that are planted that grow up through history. Mm-hmm. And they describe, they prescribe in some ways the nature of things that God has created. And you can't escape nature. Nature is always going to win. The patterns of nature will always reassert themselves, even if you try to overcome them for a while. And one of the key patterns is that God is Father, and he established men on earth to be his representatives.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously very true that if you look at the topmost positions in society, they are overwhelmingly male dominated, right? So there's never been a female president of the United States. For example, most corporate CEOs are men. And the word patriarchy, I think has a lot of usefulness as a shelling point, or it's if you're trying to identify people who are maybe dissatisfied with the evangelical mainstream teaching on gender, people who kind of talk about patriarchy, I think is a good way for them to kind of identify themselves, as a birds of a feather, if you will. But I look at the world, I'm like, we are not, kind of essentially legally and culturally, we are not a patriarchy, right? I mean, if your wife divorces you, you're a very, good chance you might get screwed over in divorce court, domestic violence laws, all on down the line, all these corporations celebrating International Women's Day. And again, I'm not going to say that women are in charge, but to the average man probably has no experience of being a patriarch. So how do you explain to like a man, or how do you convince men who basically feel that, unlike say 150 years ago where men really were patriarchs, or in Roman times when men really were patriarchs, they had real legal and cultural authority in their homes that they completely lack today. And I see a lot of the Christian leaders. So you need to lead, or you need to be, the head of the home. And how do you even think about doing that in modern society?
I mean, what I would say at one level, yeah, we would agree that a patriarchal legal system is not what we have not on the whole have in place right now. But again, was Egypt under Pharaoh in Exodus chapter, the first 15 chapters or so, was it patriarchal? Right? And if the answer is yes, then you ask yourself, well, did the patriarchs of Israel under his slavery, did they have all the benefits of patriarchal law or not? So there's a certain level of distinction we have to make here. And our friend Rich Lusk actually wrote something up. I think we posted it to our website. I can't remember, but it was his critique of what we were saying. But it was less of a critique and like, well, it depends what you mean. You know, if you mean is the cosmos patriarchal and that men are at the top on the whole, well, yeah, patriarchy is not inevitable, and that's true. If you're talking about the whole of society, then we have moved into a grossly perverse time of toxic matriarchy and weak, you know, all sorts of weird stuff, whatever you want to call what we live in. So we would want to make a distinction between there. I would say, no matter what you do, the easiest place to start, because this is what I hear from a lot of folks, like, well, we'll start marrying women, what, like the MGTOW movement, we'll back out of culture, okay? We'll back out of culture, and then it'll all fall apart because culture needs men, and then women will see it and they'll wake up, all right? And then I always ask them, okay, is this a multi-generational project? So to correct family law, can we do it in one generation? And they'll usually say probably not. And I was like, all right, so it's going to be going on long after, you know, you and your sex robot, you're dead and your sex robot's been sold on Amazon. So then what? Who continues the fight, right? Well, I don't see any way around the fight to move to a legal system, a culture that reflects God's design, that doesn't start with men taking ownership over themselves. How can you rule others if you won't rule yourself? And then creating families, because you can't have a culture war, as Doug Wilson said, without a culture. And culture flows from lots of different locuses, right? But definitely one of them is the home. And so where we have to start living out patriarchy, patriarchy, manhood, purposes of God as revealed in His Word, we have to do that in the home, and that's where we'll start to reassert these things. That's why I tell any guy, and they'll say, "Well, there's no good women." Well, I guess then, all right, then don't get married. What do you want me to tell you? Like, I'm sick of arguing with these guys. Like, it's simply not true. You know, it's a waste of my time. Where do I find women? Well, they're half of everybody, right? They're like, there's lots of them, okay, and they're roughly parity in every single generation. And is it rough? It is rough, but such as times where men have to be extraordinary.
Right. I mean,
to circle back to your question, Aaron, to answer that question, you do need to distinguish between, which Lusk in his article distinguishes between patriarchy as the basic creational design that God built into the world, in which men are generally ordered towards leadership, and then patriarchy as any man-made system of cultural and legal principles or customs that arises from this patriarchal creational order. So one is dependent on the other, and it's the underlying nature and creational pattern which is inevitable, and then the cultures and laws and norms that are established on top of that can vary very much depending on whether the patriarchy is godly or not.
Okay, well, no, that kind of gives me a sense of where you're coming from on this, because I do think that the average person does not experience the world as patriarchal. I think, to a great extent, and a lot of times I feel like these pastors are really trying to tell men to make bricks without straw, in the sense that they're ordering them to take all this, assert all this leadership, which of course they don't actually mean.
That's a great analogy, because that's an example of evil patriarchy right there.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, if the men actually did try to assert any leadership or authority, they would quickly find the pastor doesn't have their back in most cases as well. You also talk about fatherhood as critical to the establishment of masculinity and manhood, and yet we have mass fatherlessness in the world today. Either genuinely fathers gone. Or there was never, it was a lot of times today, women are having kids through artificial insemination, deliberately, without essentially a father in their life, or just a de facto father was not there. And so how do we deal with that reality in this world of, it's critical for, men to have a father, and yet so many men don't have fathers?
Go, Michael.
Sure. Well, someone asked me this question the other night. First off, since masculinity is really learned from other men, so there's a saying like women become, right, and or women are, men become. So women just she grows into her productivity and into her beauty, like she just doesn't, right? She grows into it. Where masculinity is super tied up with your ability to produce and to overcome and contribute to the team in your output. That is tied to skill, really, and that's why you have a lot of these rites of passages and whatever throughout ages where a guy has to accomplish something like that to be brought into manhood. So I think everyone acknowledges that manhood is something you kind of you grow into, that you're welcome into, and it's caught in that sense. You learn from being around other men, and if you're not around other men, there's a lot that you don't learn. You don't learn how to shake hands. You don't learn when to be quiet, when to have eye contact, and like I told a guy that you need to work on having better eye contact, and then I ran into him at a conference, and he was like, he wouldn't break eye contact. And I was like, hey, do you stare at your girls like that when you're talking to them? And he's like, yeah. He says, they say I have an intense stare. And I was like, yeah, I feel like you're going to rape me, man. like he didn't know. He hasn't had a guy to help like take off the rough edges, and that you learn that by being around. A lot of it you just absorb almost. So when dad's not there or uncle or whoever to help, then you have to learn, you have to try to do it by being taught. So podcasts, books, Gumroad classes. You'll notice when guys ask you how to be a man, like they'll give me a reading list. Like, what's the top 100 books and 100 podcasts and 1 million, they just want you to read. But the content, it can only go so far because you actually, to develop virtue, you have to throw yourself into life. So all that as a preface to say, I'm where I'm at 41, where I should have been at probably in my late 20s or 30s. I'm behind because I didn't grow up in a functioning family and I didn't have guys there to perfect me. I'm sure I've gained some ground, like I've made up for some lost time, but I'm always going to be behind because it's just like, hey, if you're colorblind, there's things you don't experience in this life. Or if you grow up sickly, there's things you don't experience. There's consequences to broken systems and to things that aren't right. One of those consequences is we have a generation of men that are maturing much later. And so I just want to tell guys like, hey, it's okay to be behind. It's not okay to stay there, right? You have to start moving forward. And I think that's why guys are finding online societies, but are quickly finding the limits of them. Because guys don't have self-awareness. That's a big problem. They'll tell you what they think their problems are, and you meet them in person. You're like, oh, your problems aren't what you say they are. Okay. So I think that's where I would start. Bnonn, if you have anything you wanted to add.
No, not really. I think that the key idea there is very much around the data dump, is the idea that you can become a man by reading something on the internet or reading the right books or whatever. But the key thing that we talk about in our book in terms of how to make up for a dearth of fathers is that God has provided in the gospel a gospel of fatherhood. He is your father. And he has provided men on earth who can take on the role of a father. Paul speaks of himself as a father to the Corinthians, for instance. And one of the key things we bring out in our book when we discuss this is the way that he distinguishes between how the Corinthians have many teachers but not very many fathers, and he is a father to them, whereas the super apostles, as it were, are just trying to be teachers. They're not actually looking after those men's souls. They're not guiding them to become better men and to transform them into the image of Christ. So you don't have to have a biological father to have fathers. God has provided other means of fatherhood. It's just that the biological father is kind of the most earthy, on the ground way of doing it. But there is a sense in which there's a sense in which the fatherhood of the church is more real than biological fathers are. I don't want to overstate that, because the importance of biological fathers is extreme. It's hard to underestimate. But another point that we make in the book is that the way that God has set up the world, we tend to assume that he is like a father. Fathers are what we have, and then he talks about how he uses language we'll understand in order to teach us what he's like, and he's kind of like a father. But in fact, it's the other way around. He is the paradigm of what a father is, and then he gives us men in our lives, fathers, biological fathers, or pastors, or whatever the case may be. And those men are like what he is. And so whatever kind of father is in your life, there is something that he can teach you about the fatherhood of God, and it is the fatherhood of God ultimately that is going to redeem and sanctify you as a man in his image.
Yeah, I think there is. Doesn't the Bible say he's a father to the fatherless? I do think, and you're right. Like, I had my first child, and so far only child, when I was 47 years old. That is not the ideal pattern of life. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'll probably never be able to have another kid because of my age and that. And yet you've got we've had 8 or something, right, Michael? So you've like,
Yep.
I'll never have that because it's just a consequence of the way that I live my life, and you have to accept that. And yet, as they say, when you're in a hole, stop digging. And I think even very much later in life, there's still opportunities to start executing a turnaround, right?
Absolutely.
Because
Absolutely.
Jesus does transform lives. He says he is making all things new, that we have new life, and so there is hope. But I think that's one of the things, like, a lot of people kind of like lose hope, and keeping that hope up is important. And I love your point too. It's like, it's not just about book knowledge. I mean, there's so much book knowledge or podcast knowledge, but it's got to be like practically applied in the real world. Manhood is not an intellectual exercise, in a sense. I do believe that the intellectual artistic sensibilities, or that aspect of manhood, is downplayed by people who want you to all be out like a rugged outdoorsman. I don't think there's one template. Just one template of a man. There was this guy. Somebody sent me a video clip one time of this guy. He was a Christian guy doing some kind of a men's thing, and he talked about getting on the man spectrum. I don't know if you've ever seen this. And he says, you got to find your place in the spectrum. His spectrum went from Mr. Rogers to Mr. T. And he's like, those guys are both men. They represent at the edge of the spectrum, but find your place on the spectrum. You don't have to be. Not everybody's got to be Mr. T. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we need people with different ones. But at the end of the day, you can't just you can't just be YouTube smart. You actually have to take action, concrete action in the real world is where it happens.
This is actually a very important point, and we talk about this in our book when we get quite practical about how can you be a better man. Is we don't look at templates. We do use some examples. We talk about Clint Eastwood, for example, but not necessarily always in a good way. We try to draw out negative aspects of masculine stereotypes or archetypes, as well as positive ones, to get people thinking about what it is that really makes you masculine. And when we talk about the process of becoming a better man, the key thing that we focus on is the duties and the virtues that define manhood, rather than looking at some kind of template and saying, oh, I have to be like that guy, or I have to be like that guy, or assuming that because I'm not like X, therefore I'm not being manly. Mm-hmm. If you're practicing these masculine virtues, these are the things that God requires of men. These are the things that God wants you to become better in, to become more like a man. And he's given you a unique personality where you have to discover which parts of that personality are working against those virtues and duties, and which parts of your personality are working for them, and refine yourself to be more virtuous and to fulfill your duties in a way that is concordant with the actual skills and talents and personality that he's given you.
It's one interesting thing this didn't really make, we kind of deal with this in the book just a bit, but as we were in the space, one tendency that we've noticed in men is a desire for very exact instructions on how to be a man. So the comparison I make these days is a lot of these guys are or asking for turn by turn GPS instructions on manhood, where that's not how it works. It's more like God gives you a compass, you know, and maybe some rough, here's a few tools. Here's your machete, right? And like that way, go that way, and you cut your way through it. And it's part of the journey that is where you actually develop all those masculine attributes. And I think that comes from insecurity for guys who didn't have a father that modeled for them. And this also ties into why boomers have not been helpful to young men, even though I don't think it's not from a place of malice. It's from the boomers don't realize how much they just absorbed from their fathers. And they don't realize how little the younger generations absorbed from their lack of fathers. And so what they think is natural and what they think you should just get, they didn't just get. It was handed to them through their fathers. And so when these young men are like, well, how do you meet girls? Well, you just go up and talk to a girl. You know, these guys don't know. And they're like, well, just like when I do a date, what time should it be? Should it be on a weekend or a weeknight? And, you know, they start asking like all these really exact questions. And it's from a place of like, they want to do a good job. They want to be tell me what to do and I'll do it, man. But what these guys have to realize is like, look, you've been deprived of a model. And now you just gotta take the risk, man. You gotta go. Yeah. You gotta throw yourself into it. And I know it's scary, but rejection and trial and error, all that's part of this. And that's what you should learn from your dad. Your dad disciplining you. Your dad, like the other day, my son was trying to lift up a paint barrel, little paint bucket up the steps, and he was having the worst time. Mm-hmm. He did all the way to the tops of the steps because I'm not grabbing that paint bucket. Mm-hmm. He needs to struggle. And now if he was about to fall down the steps, I would have caught him and the paint. But I wanted him to struggle to the top of it, you know, and I wanted him to get there. And there's dads that know when to come in to save you, when to let you struggle, when to encourage you. And if you've been deprived of that, deprived of God's design, there are going to be consequences, psychologically speaking. And we're dealing with fatherlessness right now where these guys, this is why you get into the manosphere and everything is so exact. Like this label, that pill, these steps, the gamma, beta, alpha, sigma, all this stuff is because that appeals to a mind that thinks that the world runs like code and you can code and hack your way through life. But there are even game referring to pickup artistry methods. All game can really produce is short-term sexual strategies where there's a lot of factors in your way, like basically a loose woman that's got alcohol in her. It's like where most of these guys have their success. It cannot, because it's a shortcut, it is only like appearing, you're giving like, for example, women will mistake, I saw this quote from someone, they'll mistake cruelty for power, for masculine power, because, you know, and so they'll be attracted sometimes to cruel, abusive men. And so these are the issues we're up against right now. Guys know how to like fake it, but you actually have to become these things. You really have to embody them.
Yeah. And, you know, I'm the kind of guy who, you know, I never tested as autistic, but I've tried closer to that end of the spectrum. I actually was a software developer for a long time, still do it. And, you know, I like the code. I like the rules. I like to have it all mapped out. I'm, you know, have historically been very risk averse. And, you know, want to have every single contingency mapped out and all that, which helps you when you're a computer guy designing systems that, you know, can never go down. But
you like the error handling side of things.
Yeah, I like doing error handling, and I always tested the code well, but it doesn't work so well in real life. And so I always have to force myself out of that and into the discomfort zone of risky, unknown situations where you don't know what the outcome's going to be, and you're in that ambiguity, and you got to like figure it out. And that's like, you know, that has not been a comfortable place, but I always try to like say, you need to, you know, constantly be pressing into the discomfort on account of how I, you know, sort of overly. So I see why guys are attracted to that model, because that's a model that's very attractive to me.
See, I'm the flip side. I've realized this because I'm not like you at all. Because when there's rules or someone like when we went out to get lunch together, the guy told me there wasn't tables. I'm like, there's tables. I'll just go get a table, like, And so I have a tendency to think like rules aren't for me, and I just don't even care. And I never approved due dates for papers in college. I was like, I'll just turn them in, and I always did get past it. And that looks like alpha to a lot of people, but frankly, men have to have self-discipline and understand an ordered world, or all those tendencies lead to absolute recklessness and breakdown. And another concept that we try to pull out in our book that we talk about, and it's not that we believe truth is strung up between two extremes necessarily, but there is a desire to keep things in between the ditches. Like guys that are a little wild and reckless free spirits, and that's kind of how I'm wired, do need to develop an understanding of the structure, the rules, what's respectful, what's not respectful. And guys that like love a rule-based world, they've got to learn to kind of be like have the barbarian warrior side to them or whatever, and that's why these so often when you get into this, you said this earlier, that's right, is that there is a man spectrum, and we got to be careful that we're not trying to. This is part of the problem I see with guys like Driscoll. Driscoll presented himself as the way men ought to be, right? And I don't know if he did that on purpose or whatever. I don't know what he believes. But that is what came across at times. And there's a whole variety of ways you can embody masculinity that glorifies God, and that and it's good. Such is the dilemma we find ourselves in.
Another topic that you cover in the book that you don't see in a lot of men's books is gravitas. And I was really glad to see this. It's, not a word we talk about much these days, and it sort of has a certain ineffable quality to it. It's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. I actually spoke at an event that had been organized in honor of the installation of a new president of a liberal arts college one time. And it was a Presbyterian college. It had been historically Presbyterian. So this guy brought in a Presbyterian minister from Chicago to give the invocation, and he and his wife were there. And I really didn't know who this guy was. And he gave this prayer, and this guy just exuded gravitas. I'm like, I need to go back and figure out who this guy was, because he was not what I would have stereotypically expected of like a mainline pastor. But this guy just sounded like the kind of person who ought to be preaching in the church where like all the big shots in town come. He just had that air about him and the way he did it. I'm like, man, that's gravitas. And how do you define gravitas? And
one of the ways in which we define it is to take it back to God himself. In scripture, the Hebrew term for glory is kabod, and it literally means weightiness. And we talk about the way that glory and gravitas are therefore very strongly connected, just in terms of the actual imagery that's used in scripture. It doesn't come out very easily in an English translation, because you don't tend to think of glory and gravitas as being very similar ideas. But in terms of what the Bible is actually saying, the words that it's actually using, those two terms are very similar. And the weightiness that God has is something that he confers upon us, both in an undeserved sense and in a deserved sense. So there's a sense in which all men have gravitas, have glory, when they are God's sons, because they're made in his image. So they represent him, they have a resemblance to him. But it's also something that we have to grow into. He doesn't make us so that we just automatically exude gravitas. We don't automatically have this kind of weightiness, except in a kind of a right. It's a right that we have. It's something which we have the right to develop in ourselves. And in order to develop it, we have to actually become like him, which requires us to exercise virtue, to become dutiful in the things that he has given us to do. And as we do that, we become more weighty, and we learn, we internalize what it is to be like God. And by doing that, a natural process occurs in which you gain the kind of gravitas that most men want to have and try to fake.
yeah, we live in such a youth-obsessed culture. Maybe that goes back to the 60s. We've had a youth-obsessed culture since then. And the idea that as you grow older, you would acquire this gravitas, or this kind of, air about, this kind of weight of presence about you. as you mature, just seems totally foreign to the modern world. Instead, you're constantly trying to make yourself appear more like a, early 20s guy, more like a college kid. It's almost like, man, you wouldn't want that because you're going to look like an old dude.
You see a lot of that on talk shows. I don't watch a lot of talk shows because it's so painful, but I do occasionally see clips, and a lot of the actors, the celebrities on those, they act like, the men act like teenage girls a lot of the time. Some of the men have a lot of charisma and to some extent some gravitas as well, but a lot of them are just unbelievably effeminate, and it's because they're trying to look like they're young and hip, and even if they've now reached 40 or 50 years old, they just come across as idiots. It's really sad.
Another concept that you talk about in the book is fraternity, which interestingly, I wrote a little bit about fraternity in my last newsletter. I didn't necessarily get the connection to the show, but what is the need that men have for fraternity in today's world?
Well, men were created to live in community. So it's not good for men to be alone, right? So that's the natural fulfillment for that is in his wife. But out of them coming together in marriage and having children, they create culture, right? And so there's like a secondary fulfillment of that all that comes from that. So men are meant to live in community and work together. And just like women are meant to live in community and work together, like there's a brotherhood, there's a sisterhood. And there's a need for each group of people to have someone that understands the masculine drives. Like, so for example, we talk about this in a book where there's this article I read where this soldier just wants to get back to war. He just wants to get back to war. And it's not that he doesn't hate, it's not that he doesn't love his family or whatever. But what it is that there was a clear mission and there's brothers working alongside him. And I think what men need is we need guys that are aside us. And then the way I always explain it is that there's this study where they put these two chairs in a room randomly, and they put two little girls in there, and they would take the chairs and they face them towards each other so they could talk. And that's women. They want to like nurture and build these relationships. And then, but the boys would put them kind of side by side, looking out at the world. And men work side by side in that sense, working at the world. And work is important to both same sex and different sex relationships. But men especially need brothers because to build something bigger requires community. So it's not surprising to me that conservatives and Republicans kind of have a low focus on brotherhood and community, because they're all like, they really have adopted this loner, grifter, individualistic, grill American attitude, where liberals understand the power of community, right? And so they always have like community organizers and whatever. But it's interesting that the liberals have this sort of feminine posture to them, where the conservatives have this macho posture that falls in line with like kind of the country cowboy outlaw trope, whatever. And what we need though is men that work together. And Bnonn brought this out in her book when he talked about the Magnificent Seven. Is that right? I mean, that right? That's one the samurai, based on the samurais, where they're like each have their ability, but when they're all together, they perfect each other. And it's just like a football team, or it's like I work for a company and we have marketing. I'm working with our new marketing department to try to work some stuff out here. And I bring my expertise and their expertise. And so fraternities like that, we need guys to work alongside. And when you don't have that, you don't get the pushback. You don't get, you don't have the iron sharpening iron and all that sort of stuff.
One of the things that we do in the book is we compare the Clint Eastwood's character in Unforgiven, who is kind of like a trope of masculinity, where you've got this lone wolf, and it's like he's cool because he's alone, and the more alone he gets and the more people fall away from him, the more awesome he becomes. And we talk about how this is really teaching something completely 180 degrees to how masculinity really does work, and compare that with the Magnificent Seven. I really appreciated your article that you did recently, number 58, I think it was, in the Masculinist, because of the fact that it talked about loyalty as something which is important to fraternity. And that's something that we kind of touch on in our book as well, in the fact that when you start to excel as a man, when you start to actually practice masculine virtues and duties, you tend to have this mentality of other men who are like crabs in a barrel trying to pull you back down. And it's that kind of thing which is incredibly destructive to fraternity, is this kind of backbiting envy that James talks about in, I think it's James 4. And the alternative to that, the solution to that, is the kind of loyalty, what Scripture would call chesed, loving kindness or faithfulness, covenant loyalty, which is completely integral to building a masculine community that you can rely on, and which actually builds up each individual man in his own way.
Yeah, you know, in our society used to have a tremendous amount of male spaces. You know, the workplace was essentially a male space in many senses. You know, some professions and occupations were more female-centric, you know, but if you went to the office or you went to the factory, you were in kind of a male space. If you were on a submarine, for example, you were in a male space, or a lot of male clubs, all the fraternal organizations and things. And then essentially, you know, every space that was entirely male has been essentially targeted for elimination by society. And, you know, they've either been destroyed or they've been forced to go co-ed, if you will. And I think there are only 2 or 3 colleges left, for example, that are all male. And so the male camaraderie that used to come out of some of these all-male spaces really doesn't exist anymore, and men have not found a replacement for that in other structures. You know, most men I know don't seem to have great close friendships with other men, and certainly not engaged in common projects the way that you would have had if it was your place of employment, or it's a fraternal society that's doing civic projects, or, you know, anything that had some purpose to it, you know, beyond just the purely social.
One of the things you pointed out is the fact that so many men, the only friends they have that are men are through their wives. And their wives, you know, if something goes wrong in the marriage, they lose all of their male friends. And that's awful.
Yeah. And over time, people's social networks tend to decay, I think, as they get older. And
because, again, it's all based on kind of sentimentality rather than on any kind of shared vision or project that they're working on together.
Yeah, I mean, I think men finding a band of brothers is super important. And the loyalty aspect, it's just astonishing to me how little loyalty there is in this world. I mean, even among all these online right-wing groups who sort of all act like they're kind of neo-fascist or whatever, they're constantly like doxing each other and sending screenshots of their email list to the Atlantic Reporter. And, you know, it's to the point you basically, you know, the same thing's true of left. That whole national partnership scandal in the Presbyterian Church in America, where some member of their email list, leaked years of emails. It's like, it's just such a kind of sad state of affairs that, you know, from left to right, there seems to be so little loyalty, to the point where Donald Trump was right to never use email, I think, because you just got to assume every single thing is going to be leaked by somebody to somebody at some point. It's kind of sad.
Well, there's a strong connection between loyalty and courage, which you see in the fact that there's also a strong connection between faith and courage in Scripture. Fear drives out faith, and faith drives out fear. So if you think about Peter, for example, getting out of the boat onto the water to walk to Jesus, and then he sees the waves and he gets freaked out and he starts to be afraid and he starts to sink and he's like, "Lord, save me." And Jesus tenderly rebukes him and says, why were you afraid? It was the fear, the faith that kept you going, and the fear that made you sink. And the same faith and loyalty are intimately connected in Scripture. And the fact that when you are afraid, you tend to lose faith, or you tend to break faith, is if you think about what's going on in the world today, the problem is that we have an enormous number of cowards, loudmouthed cowards, who like to talk a good talk, but when the pinch comes, they haven't got what it takes to actually stand firm. And so if you are going to try to be loyal without courage, it's not going to work well for you.
Yeah. Again, I'm talking with Michael Foster and Tennant about their book, It's Good to Be a Man, which is coming out very soon, maybe in just a week or two, from Canon Press. So be sure to check that out wherever fine books are sold. And again, a reminder, hit the subscribe button on YouTube, hit the like button on YouTube, and please leave a rating on Apple Podcast if you're listening to me there. So I want to ask one last question about the book, or cover one more topic in the book, and then I want to get to some of the questions people submitted in the chat and maybe have a little bit kind of closing discussion. What is the relationship between mission and manhood? You have a chapter on mission. What is the relationship between mission and manhood?
I think this is probably where we get the most pushback and frustration. Well, I don't know, from guys, because we do use mission in we give a definition of it, but it is kind of vague and big. The way I look at mission is it is your practical, the way you live out catechism question number 1. What is the chief end of man? To glorify God and enjoy him forever. Okay. So then the catechism goes on to explain how you do that, right? By obeying God's word, more or less. But what we would say is mission is like, all right, what's the best way for you to glorify and enjoy God with your gifts in your time, providentially where God's placed you, and get to work on that. So it's not just vocation, but it's kind of broader than that, using everything and thinking all the gifts God's giving you to start to develop this direction you're heading in your life, these big goals you have. And guys kind of freeze up because they want it to be like, I do 5-year plans. This is what I do for almost everything. And I'll break everything down.
Just like Stalin.
That's right. You know who else did 5-year plans?
Who else did?
The Soviet Union was big for 5-year plans.
Well, comrades, we shall overcome.
Yeah.
But I do that because I think it's pretty easy. It's a goal is something that's achievable with difficulty, and I can plan out that far. But I'm trying. I have very particular goals for myself, for my family, and whatever. And I think through those goals, and then I make adjustments as I go. It's not unlike a book. Your mission, like we had a mission to write a book to help men in this way, men, and we have the ability to do that by writing. We developed those skills, and as we wrote the book kind of changed, right? It developed and became its own thing, and mission's kind of this vague goal that you're working towards that can change. And so men have to be on mission because they have to be moving, they have to be working towards something, building something, and if they don't, they won't develop gravitas. And women want to be called to a man doing something. Adam was given the work of the creation mandate, and then Eve was brought to him to help her. One reason guys can't get women is women have more gravitas than they do, and guys aren't doing anything because their mission is getting swallowed up by pornography or video games or laziness or just kind of cruising through life without any big goals. So mission is very important to attract other brothers, because fraternity is formed around doing work together more than anything. That's why your best friends will usually come from work, or from maybe growing up in a particular school environment. But also it's what attracts women, are attracted to men that are doing something, accomplishing something. And so it ends up being very important to those two practical things. What else would you say?
Well, the key thing with mission is that it takes us back to where we start, which is, why did God make man at all? And as Michael said, with the creation mandate, the idea is that man is given dominion over the world to represent God's rulership on the earth and to extend that rulership into the earth. And mission is basically how the individual man takes on that mandate of dominion. So how are you going to exercise dominion on behalf of God in your world? And that can be a very broad view, as Michael says. It can be pretty vague. It can be like, this is sort of my life's purpose. or you can get down into individual missions. You can kind of nest missions, stack missions on top of each other. So you've got your kind of overall mission for your life, and then you have individual short-term missions, like this month I'm going to do this, or this year I'm going to do this, or the next 5 years this is my main mission. It's not like a paint by numbers system, but we use the word mission to describe really what it is that you're doing in order to exercise dominion on behalf of God.
Yeah, I actually think this is one of the most important concepts that men don't get. And this is one area where I really feel the church badly steers men wrong. In my view, mission is what orients your household outward into the world, right? Again, as you said, extending the kingdom of God, ordering the earth. And so much of the church's teaching defines a man's mission as being a servant leader to his wife and kids. His mission is entirely oriented towards his family, towards his woman. His woman is, in fact, his mission. His wife is his mission. And, one of the famous manosphere writers, Royce or Chateau Hartis, he had his 16 commandments. And one of them was, thou shalt make your mission, not your woman, your priority. No woman is your everything. And if she is, she soon will not be anymore. And I really, think that area of like the man's mission, equating a man's kind of role in life or purpose in life, which God created him, is inward oriented towards the household, primarily, instead of, orienting the house, building his household, yes, but orienting that household outward, not just inward to itself, but outward into the world, accomplishing kingdom purposes, I think is very important.
Amen. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And that's how we kind of see men expand the boundary of the house and the women. So we kind of push it. We knock the weeds out. We get rid of the thorns and thistles and push out into the world. And then our wives refine the world behind us. They perfect it. They bring it to the next, like you give a woman flour, she gives you bread. You give a woman some of your seed, as in your sperm, she gives you a person. Women are these multipliers, refiners, strengtheners of what men do, and men push the boundaries out. And that's what you really see a woman doing in Proverbs 31, is that she's been well financed by her husband, and she can like build their household out. So it's a beautiful picture. But men have to have that big vision, and the church really crucifies men for being ambitious. And you go to 1 Timothy chapter 3, and we know it's a godly aspiration to be an elder. There's lots of godly aspirations. There's a lot of godly ambitions. We need guys that are ambitious lawyers, ambitious politicians, ambitious doctors and entrepreneurs and all that. And the church really punishes men for having a drive like that and discourages it. And we just can't have that. That's one reason we're losing the so-called cultural war, is that Christians are not going into those sectors. And when they do, they're perceived as a threat to the stability of our churches, as opposed to being the vertebrae that bring in money, bring in people, bring in excitement, and opens up the networks of possibilities. So I think it's really key to a lot of different areas that we're dealing with as a culture right now.
Yeah, there's so much we could say there, just in terms of the exercising dominion involves fighting a lot of the time. And, if you're representing God's rule and there is, in fact, an evil patriarchy that's pushing against you, then obviously that's going to involve conflict. And the church is just so conflict avoidant. And they think that it's like they've reduced the Great Commission to this. It's like they have reduced the Great Commission to individual pietism. Which just disgusts me so much I can't even express it in words. But the Great Commission is about making disciples of the nations themselves, exercising dominion over the whole earth on God's behalf. And the church nowadays just wants nothing to do with that and will punish you for trying to do it.
So here's a thought real quick. I've thought about this recently, and it's kind of tangential, but maybe it'll play here. I've been thinking about why churches are failing right now under COVID. And I'm convinced is that the most pastors are of a managerial class. And there's nothing wrong with managerial pastors, actually. But managerial people maintain a system, and they're concerned about process and rules. That's their job. They didn't make the system, they maintain it. So when there's a massive disruption, those rules and processes can get messed up. And if you don't have if you're risk adverse and you don't know how to pivot and do manly things, what happens is suddenly these kind of white knight managerial class pastors become tyrants right away because they don't know what to do. So they lock down on the rules, right? No, these are the rules. And we saw this with churches that kind of fumbled the football in the way they dealt with the COVID stuff, which is, controversial and not an easy issue. I'm not trying to downplay that. But I think there was these really soft guys that suddenly became like crazy strict in every which way. I mean, I knew a church that actually had a lottery to be able to come in because of social distancing. Or I knew several churches where you had to actually book your seats a couple of days beforehand. So this isn't just wear masks and don't wear masks. It's like it went to a whole nother level. And so those guys are all about establishing stability, and they're fine in times of stasis. In times of lack of stasis, they don't do well. Now, when you have a guy that is kind of a masculine risk taker, entrepreneurial, pushing out there, he does disrupt the stability. And so churches, because of their managerial class of pastors, they view those sort of masculine men as either guys that have to be broken down and turned into cogs in their particular system, or they perceive them as an entire threat to the system. These guys are being driven out of the church. And this is what the church needs, especially in times of disruption like ours, where, whether we're talking supply chain or political issues or cultural issues, or the change from broadcast TV to streaming networks. I mean, we're undergoing a pretty significant cultural shift right now. Guys like that is what you need. And this is part of what we hope with our book, is just to start getting men moving in the right direction and encouraging those guys who have those masculine inclinations not to think of themselves as the pariah that they're often treated in these churches. And so it's a big issue, and one that I've been thinking about lately as I've watched churches kind of implode.
Interesting. Well, I think it may be a good point. I hope you guys have a little time here. I don't know what your time situation is, but I'd love to take a few questions here from the audience.
Yeah,
and I'm not going to get to them all, but what I will do is take all of the comments that came in that contain a question, and I'll email them out, and you can, if you so desire, respond to them through your platform. I know you're always looking for content, so I will do that. But here's one from John Smith. How should we go about talking to our girlfriends, or presumably wives, about biblical manhood and womanhood?
I think a 20-week study on Piper and Grudem's Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood's the way to go, I think. Or maybe an Amy Bird book. I don't know. Can we just be friends? This is so weird so here's what undergirds this question, okay? What undergirds this question is I feel tension from women that they're not going to like the biblical design for sexuality. How do I bring that tension to the surface so we can begin to talk about it and deal with it? That's a lot of times what I think is going on when I hear questions like this. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth there, whoever asked that, but I've noticed that a lot of times. What I would say is, let me give you an example. We had a guy on our online society called Tyrannus Hall who asked, he said, he told us how his wife didn't want to have a lot of kids like he did. And he was talking about basically no contraceptive, having 9, 10, 11 kids, whatever. And so I said, well, how many kids have you guys had? And he was like, well, we haven't had any. And I said, well, man, they come one at a time. Usually start with one. And so what he's doing is he's feeding her anxiety, because he's like, well, let's have 10 kids. That's like saying, hey, to someone that's never bench pressed before, let's start with 400 pounds. And whoa there. And so what I would say is let these things generate naturally is one way to talk about them. How are you going to avoid sexual conversations in a sexual relationship? And any male-female relationship has a sexual element to it, not necessarily erotic, but sexual. If you're dating, there is a erotic. I hope there's an erotic. I hope there's attraction, or break it off. Those issues are going to come up naturally. But the main thing is not to get defensive and not put her under attack. What you want to do in a dating relationship with a woman is engage, show her stability and adventure at the same time. That you're a guy that's stable, but a guy that can also have a good time. And when you talk, if you get defensive about sexuality, that is going to turn a woman off. It's going to repel her. So how do you talk about it? Well, when she says something like, well, I don't think men should be leaders, then you can laugh it off. Two, and say, well, I think men should be great leaders, right? And there's all sorts of ways to come. The main thing is don't be defensive, and you have to engage her at an emotional level, right? But these guys think you can argue a woman into submission, and it's never, ever, 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 ever going to happen. There's not enough content. There's not enough articles. There's not enough books. That's not how you do it. You do it by being a man, but also demonstrating what you're doing. I would recommend A Failure of Nerve by Edwin Friedman. I think that's probably a better book on the topic, and it's not even on the topic, but yet it is. Those are my thoughts. Bnonn, how do you how did you slay all those women back in the day?
I was such a white knight that I wouldn't have any way of answering that now. I think that the way that I deal with most objections today is, as you've said, is either to treat it as ridiculous and flip it. So if someone says that they don't think men should be leaders, saying that they should be great leaders is a good way of going. Or if I'm not fielding an objection necessarily, if it's more just a conversation and something controversial comes up, my tendency is to simply state the facts as I know them, as if they were obvious. Because so much of the difficulty that men have in dealing with these kinds of tensions is they're responding to everything that's going on in their head rather than everything that's going on with the actual person they're talking to. So they think when somebody's having a conversation with them that the rest of the world is there watching and they're sitting outside the Overton window. And so they get very defensive and they have to kind of somehow push the world back and keep everything at bay and show that they're right. Whereas if you state from your own, I don't want to say from your own strength, that sounds stupid, but if you are simply confident in asserting what you know to be true, then you tend to have the same effect on the other person that you were otherwise expecting them to have on you. So you were feeling anxious and cornered. If you simply ignore that feeling and state the facts, it tends to make the other person feel like, well, hang on a minute, maybe what I think isn't actually true. And you'd be surprised at the number of people who, this is something that I've done some study on, it's very interesting. The number of people who engage in what's called preference falsification, which is where you pretend to believe something or a more extreme version of what you actually believe in order to fit in with a perceived group. And the amount of work that people do in adjusting themselves to what they think other people believe is incredibly high. And if you simply ignore what you think other people believe and state what you believe, you might discover that you actually have a lot more in common with someone than you realized, and that the stuff that they were saying before is more a product of what they were expecting you to approve of than what they themselves believe.
Right. Thank you, gentlemen. I got another question here from Grant Armbruster. How do we find good men for our daughters?
I think this is a problem, finding good daughters for our men as well, right? Finding spouses for our children is difficult. Well, number one is to raise up godly men and godly women and let them filter. So the more resigned a man is to his masculinity and a woman to their femininity, the more attractive they will be to the opposite sex. And they'll draw a greater number of potential spouses. So that's one step. So raise them to be masculine, and raise them to be feminine. If they're a woman, raise them to live in line with that. Two, teach them how to filter out, like some basic filtering steps. Like if she's like this, no. If he's like that, no. there's a long talk that we could have there that I'm not going to right now. I think we wrote a blog post somewhere, or maybe we should. Nonetheless, the other thing is to improve your network. So for me, one reason I'm in Moscow right now. I'm out here. I'm in the Monarch Motel, but New St. Andrews is just right over the way, and so is Christchurch. One reason I'm out here is to promote our book, but also to meet people. And I was at another church out in Vancouver that I've got good relationships with, but I also have a lot of relationships with people in different Reformed Baptist churches. And definitely one of my goals is to know a lot of generally like-minded people to open up a world of options to my sons and my daughters. So one of my sons, I'm going to send out to a church to intern at a company that's connected to that church, and also sit underneath Chris Wiley's preaching for a while, just to be under a different man. But also I want him to see the other girls that are out there. They got some pretty girls that are godly. I want him to know how broad and big the world can be and what's possible for him out there. And when you build that bigger network, then you know about what's going on out there, and you can help your kids know. Those are a few things, right? A lot of guys, I think, are smoking crack on how pretty they think their daughters are. I always hear that. They're like, my daughter's so pretty, yet she can't get any suitors, or she's got such a great personality. And then I meet them and I'm like, well, she's not that great. I think what you need is also older women that'll just lay down the law with your daughters and help them realize, like, there's a reason you're single at 30 is you're precocious and difficult to talk to, and maybe just be pretty and dumb sometimes. How about that? There's a quote for the Aaron Rand podcast.
You're gonna tweet that one out. You get a lot of hate for that there.
I've heard women say that, and they know that's true. But it's just who wants to be married to a woman that you're always in a wrestling match with, unless it's a very particular type of wrestling match. That another quote for the Aaron Rand podcast. But those are a few of my thoughts. Train them to be masculine. Train them to be feminine to their daughter. Teach them filtering and broaden the network so they have more opportunities. I think I've heard you use Moneyball. There's a sort of Moneyball tactics you can deploy here.
Yeah, one of the things that I actually want to develop, and I was thinking about this more for men, rather than men trying to find a wife, is you need to play Moneyball for marriage. And, with about 70% of the divorces initiated by women, you really have to have a divorce risk calculator that's very statistical and says, what are the attributes that heavily correlate with divorce? And, because you got to go in with your eyes wide open on that stuff. I hate to kind of be that way, but I mean, you kind of got to do it.
Higher, more there. So it jumps to like straight up like 90% when they have at least a BA.
Yeah.
The more educated they are. And so what's the problem? Is it that they're educated, or is it the education?
I'm not quite sure it's quite like that, but there's all these.
Well, what I was going to say, it's not the education is the problem. I'm not anti-education. I think it's the particular education and the things they're being fed in those institutions builds a sort of culture and attitude in a woman and expectations. Also, if you put tens of thousands of dollars of debt into some degree, you want to get your money's worth out of that degree and go work in that area, and you end up delaying marriage for very reasonable reasons, right? Like anyone would make those choices. But then like you're 30 something and you're not married yet, and you're just getting out of debt if you are disciplined to actually even pay off your student loans. And those are the different aspects that I think play out in that.
Well, I don't know how old your son is. I thought it was intriguing that you're sending him to spend some time interning and I guess living with someone else in a different part of the country. It reminded me of the New England Puritans who used to do that with their sons. They always had to go spend a year or two living with another family and essentially kind of being their free labor for a while. And that was part of their finishing process for kids.
Right. They describe that in Edmund Morgan's The Puritan Family, actually. Really good book. Edmund Morgan's a great, he was an atheist, but a wonderful historian of Puritan America. Very, very academically reliable and trustworthy. But he talks about that. For me, it's, I think Puritans understood the bubble of the family. That's potentially dangerous. And so what I think we also have to understand the bubble of our church communities. And so my son's 15 and and it's like, these are really close friends that have moved away that we understand. And I'm not really worried about some of the other things I'd be worried about with younger kids or a daughter, perhaps. So, and it's probably going to be like 6 weeks. But yeah, I want him to get out. I want them to see that. What I notice with a lot of homeschool kids, especially that are homeschooled by their mom, is that they're risk adverse, and it's very destructive to them, especially the men. And I want my kids to grow up being men that can take risk and kind of do big things and learn that. And I know they'll do well if I build some of those virtues into them.
I have a question here from Bradley Reith. I hope I pronounced that correctly. When a man has been led by an overwhelmingly masculine leader in a bad way, say an abusive pastor, how would you recommend those men recover and balance in a correct manner?
I know Bradley's pastor, which he speaks of. I know Bradley. It's your responsibility, right? Don't be a fanboy. Stop emulating pastors. Like, we have to stop having fanboys. And so we have our responsibility to embody biblical attributes. But when we grow up from broken homes and all that, we do emulate our pastors. In the Calvary Chapel movement, Chuck Smith was kind of the founder of it. Well, he was the founder of it. And I was in the Calvary Chapel movement when I first became a Christian. And it's great. You love the Bible and love people. Kind of a hippie church, good stuff. But the people that were discipling under Chuck, they would wear like Hawaiian shirts, because Chuck always did later in his life. Actually, when he preached in a suit, though. But other times he wore a Hawaiian shirt. People didn't know that. He'd always also say, and talk really slow, and you would see the people in the Calvary Chapel movement take on his attributes. He always say, and these are like Midwesterners, like wearing like Hawaiian shirts before that was the thing. So I think what we have to do is actually understand the attributes of masculinity and try to embody those, and not attach our masculinity merely to some sort of covenantal celebrity head. These sort of like these chieftains that we all end up worshiping. And this is like New Calvinism is the worst. I used to always tease them because it was kind of self-loathing. I'd realize like, man, we treat these guys like they're football players. And I'd always talk about fantasy pastors, like fantasy baseball or something. Like, I'll trade you my Chandler for your, like what?
But isn't that like just ancient? Didn't Paul talk about that in 1 Corinthians? It's like, I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas,
Yep.
It's like these cults of personality, just perennial. There's nothing new under the sun is one of my. That's why I'm not a post-millennialist. I'm a there's nothing new under the sun, man. But
that's right. The church has been since the get-go, it's been expanding. So I agree.
No, I think that's great. That's great. It's great insight there.
But that's something we've been trying to avoid in It's Good to Be a Man, is something that we started from the very beginning we were talking about, is we don't want to be giving men advice that in order to actually become more masculine, they also have to become more like Michael Foster or more like Tennant. It's not a question of becoming like another person's personality. It's a question of what are the key attributes, duties, virtues that men need to be working on in their own lives. Focus on those things and figure out, if you can, figure out how to do that with the skills and the personality God has given you, and find other men in your life who can help to guide you do that. Other men who can say, look, I think that this thing that you're working on, you're trying to achieve the right thing, but you're doing it the wrong way, or this particular thing that you're doing is really good, or this particular thing is not going to work with the personality type you have. You're setting yourself up for failure. People in your life who know you well and understand what you're trying to achieve and can help to guide you in doing that. Those are the kinds of things you need, rather than to be obsessing over personality or particular methods that other men have used that you've seen succeed for them. Well, maybe they'll succeed for you, maybe they won't. And the flip side of that is, if you've been in a kind of abusive relationship before, you tend to you look at what someone's done and you want to avoid every single thing that you associate with them, which is not necessarily a great idea. Often what they were doing, if they had attenuated it, if they'd scaled it back, it would have actually been a good thing. And so you need to be able to separate yourself from that kind of instinctive loathing that you have in order to stand back and say, how much of this was good and where did it go wrong, rather than just throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
A great example of this is the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, which I think is a wonderful podcast. Though, boy, their sound engineer is terrible. Like behind Mike Cosper is always like there's always a hiss. I'm like, how are you this big and can't figure that out? Anyhow, what's interesting is a guy like me who has been around and seen like legit church abuse and like all sorts of problems. And I totally have zero problem with authority, Puritan or not Puritan, Presbyterian in my thinking. I'm for that stuff, but it's clear that there's a sort of liberal agenda to use it to beat up on bold leadership and biblical sexuality. And so conservatives come to it, and their tendency is to overreact and say, you know, I've seen a lot of people suddenly try to defend Driscoll out of it. I was like, no, there was real problems, guys. This is like real problems. And this is actually kind of a machismo, like Driscoll is like a macho boomer, more or less. I know they say it's Gen X, but if you listen carefully, how he approaches the issues of women, it's much closer to boomer than it is younger guys. Nonetheless, so they can't listen to it and benefit from where they can, because it's either like it's an all or nothing way of looking at it. When you come out from underneath this ministries, probably the best thing to do is dial back and focus on things in your life. So when I was kind of doing a life reset here about 2.5 years ago, trying to decide where I wanted to be ministerial, long-term, where I wanted my denominational affiliations to be and all that sort of stuff. We just moved into an apartment with all our kids, and I worked like 50 hours, I don't know, more than that, 60 hours a week, and paid off a ton of debt. And just took time to think, what do I want to do? I knew I wanted to finish this book with Bnonn, but outside of that, I wasn't pastoring or doing anything or speaking. I just took time to kind of reboot, because when you come out of those abusive situations, or you come out of those unstable, you're going to have a tendency to overreact. And if you think about how car wrecks happen, so when you like turn the wheel that way, you turn it a little bit to the left, and then you kind of swerve and you want to correct it, and you turn that way. And when the more you do that, the chances of you rolling your car like go up. So the main thing is when you come out stable and focus on something down the road that you know you need to get done. Okay, I need to fix this house. I need to get out of debt. I need to get in shape. Pour yourself into something productive and allow your nerves and your mind to kind of chill out. That's what I would say to guys that are coming out of this situation.
Yeah, target fixation is the problem. When I learned to ride a motorbike, the key thing that was drilled into us is if you get fixated on a target that you don't want to hit, you're going to hit it, because you go where you look. So look where you want to go. If you look at the pole that you're afraid you're going to hit, you're almost guaranteed to hit that pole. And I experienced this myself. I had to learn this the hard way. It's just how brains work. But if you look where you want to go and you don't think you're going to make it, you probably will. So when you come out of an abusive situation, look where you want to go.
Yes, same way with trap shooting. Look where you want the shot to hit. You know, they always say. I have a question for you. One of the things that you say in your book that I'm not sure I agree with is that Christianity is innately masculine. And, you know, I don't really detect a gender to Christianity. And if anything, it seems like the church is spoken of in feminine terms in the Bible and throughout church history. So I'm curious about your take on the church. Christianity is innately masculine.
Do we say that in the book that way?
I think you actually do. Actually,
I think we've talked about how the promise, I know in the opening chapter, we talk about how the promises are, how patriarchies key in the development of covenants. So think of it this way. Christianity is Christ, and Christ is a man. So there's one easy way to get to that, saying Christianity is masculine, that it's oriented around a father, son, right? And our Redeemer is a son. And the fact that he's a real human being is part of orthodoxy, and that resurrection, and that it's achieved even by a male head. So I could say masculinity is at the heart of Christianity, maybe something like that. I don't know if we said it was that way. I
It's
probably
on page 95. I just checked.
Oh,
I think probably, is that in the chapter on the Church Effeminate?
I don't know. Let me pull it up.
It's probably where we talk about the way
is.
that the church has essentially flipped it and made it so that to be masculine in the church is really to be a kind of pariah, and the church, everything is perceived as feminine. So it's speaking in response to that kind of oversteering. So it's a strong statement that could be out of context and misunderstood. What Michael's saying is correct. It's oriented around a masculine figure, and there's no getting around that.
Well, you can prepare for that one on a future much more adversarial.
Appreciate that.
I have to do some interviews besides this one. And I'm like, man, I haven't read this book for a while. You turn the manuscript in and you're like, all right, what's the next thing?
Yeah.
I'm so done.
You'd mentioned the manosphere, and, for a long time, the manosphere was really where guys were turning to get kind of a sense of manhood. They were looking for something. And there's still some of that, but now there's another group of guys who are really turning to sort of a neo-pagan thinkers, most notably the Bronze Age pervert, who wrote his book Bronze Age Mindset. And, he's really, again, it's a throwback. It's a pre-Christian concept of masculinity. I was wondering if you had any takes on BAP or that whole kind of neo-pagan masculinity movement. Jack Donovan probably falls into that in a lot of ways.
I just saw Jack. I was on a panel with Jack just a couple weeks ago and spent some time with them. I like Jack a lot. I think he's a very straight up guy in how he talks to you, and very accessible. And I find him to be really honest. And I wait till you see that panel, Aaron. Oh my goodness. Like everything I've said today pales.
Okay.
You get Jack Donovan admitting that he likes the idea of the Mormon idea of eternal progression unto godhood. There's a lot of fascinating things. So we need tradition. We don't have any. And I think why we LARP, like quite literally, why we do live action role playing, is because we want to connection to a deep tradition. Right? Why people like go all in on Lord of the Rings or whatever, and have read the Silmarillion a billion times and quote it like it's like normal to quote it all the time. It's because people want to be connected to a tradition, to roots that go far back. And part of the problem of America is that we're transient. We move all around. We're totally disconnected. This is why I think a lot of people who become Reformed end up becoming like Roman Catholics, or going into Eastern Orthodoxy, or to whatever what they grew up in, like some Pentecostal church or some independent fundamental Baptist church that really only has a church history of whenever it was founded.
Okay, 6 weeks.
6 weeks.
Yeah. I grew up in one of those churches, so I
30 or 40 years. And so you're like, man, this is crazy. I want to have connection to something old. And then you have guys like Bap, who's off Twitter, sadly. I follow him on Telegram, but he's like, doesn't have that many followers. But what I think he does is he looks at the Christian world and says, I don't want to be like that. That's not masculine. That's not manly. That's not good. Where are these guys in fighting these battles that need to happen? So he has to look backwards. And the thing is, a lot of these things are good. Like, Calvin, I believe Calvin wrote a paper on Virgil or something. I know he quotes Virgil quite a bit in the Institutes. But these guys were very aware of the classics, all these early reformers, and really anything before the modern era, like anything prior to maybe 150 years ago. If you're going to have a seminary training, you're going to know the classics fairly well. And so these guys are reaching back because they want roots and they want something that's masculine, not effeminate. And I see their immediate appeal. It does seem to me to kind of be a sort of Nietzschean worldview that's just painted over with some Greek stuff, like kind of the Ubermensch sort of.
Clearly and very Nietzschean.
Yeah, when you get into it, and it's not nearly as deep as they act like it is. But when you grow up in a shallow cotton candy world, it is intriguing. And there's so, like, I thought Bronze Age Mindset was a fantastic read. Like, it was really trippy. I was like,
I think I'm the one that told you to read that.
You did, and I did. I went and read it. I listened to it on Audible as I was like walking in the mornings. It's like, man, this book is wild. And
it is.
And it really, I found it very stimulating, and I was refreshed by how non-Christian it was, but like open. Like, I really struggled with Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules or whatever book, because I was like, man, this guy is not. He'll act like Jesus is a real person in one chapter, and the next person, it seems like he's seen as merely a Jungian archetype. And it felt very forced to me. Also, what I don't like about Peterson, old Peterson in particular, is I feel like the world's a horrible, scary place, but you just got to buck up and go out there and conquer it, right? But then there's guys like Bap that's like, the world is a place to be conquered. Let's go get it. It's a very different orientation, where it's almost like Peterson's like this nice guy beta that got the strength to go out there and do what a man's supposed to do. Whereas Bap, it's like, you're a man, you're meant for bloodshed and holy violence, and not holy violence, but
It's very true. Peterson is terrified of the world, and Bap isn't.
He is, and to me, I was like, yeah, that's how I feel. Like, yeah, God made this world for us to have dominion over. Let's go do it. And so I think Jordan Peterson, one reason he has broad appeal that Bap never had. Bap had decent, but I think Peterson really speaks to the heart of a lot of men that are scared of the world. And where Bap is like, to those of us that have a kind of normal tendencies that aren't scared of the world, like, it's freeing to hear someone say, yeah, your desire to go out and conquer is good and normal, and go get own some space, man. So,
yeah. Well, in fairness, we actually know who Jordan Peterson is, right? And we know a little bit about his life. You know, I'm not sure if the real life Bap is really a candidate for Handsome Thursday or not. You know, in a sense, when you stay anonymous, people don't know if the reality of your life matches the rhetoric of your book.
If he is the guy that they all leaked, he is a fairly handsome, accomplished dude. If he is, but if he weighed 600 pounds and gets around in a little rascal at Walmart, that also would not be the most shocking revelation in the manosphere history.
Yeah. So I want to just wrap up here. Many years ago, I think one of the things you said, kind of when I maybe first talked to you, Michael, was, it's good to be a man is a project, it's not a career, or something to that effect. What is next for what you guys are planning to do, or is there a next after the book?
We're gonna keep our newsletter going, and there'll probably be we'll probably have random podcast episodes come here and there where there's content that just makes sense to go through that channel. For me, we put a lot of time and effort into this book, and now it's done, and we got to kind of do this marketing stuff. And I think we're going to, we both have a lot of projects. Bnonn and I kind of approach it kind of like the Avengers, you know, where we have our own things that we're doing, and then we come together for projects. So I think we're in between those projects now. I personally am working on, I planted a church. Oh, here we go. Which side? Here we go. All right. East River Church. So I'm really busy with our church, and my wife and I are doing a podcast called We Made People, starting in December, theoretically, and that's kind of just our reflection on being a first generation Christian home and what it looks like when like me, you're coming from nothing. How do you deal with the fear of having children and of raising them, death of a child, all that stuff. So that's probably my next major project. And the only reason I'm willing to do that is Emily and I can grab a bottle of Pinot, put the mic out there, have a good time, and then just edit it and push it out there. Where I just I'm so busy and I have so many responsibilities. I need to make sure whatever I'm doing is focusing on what's local. And then I'm prepping for the next County Before Country conference that we're gonna have next year. So
yeah, and your church is growing like gangbusters.
Yep, I hear we broke 200 this past Sunday. I was gone, but I heard that we are over 200 now, and we will hit 1 year on December 5th. So we're not even a year old.
Wow.
So, yep. It's a wild ride.
Well, there is kind of a realignment going on as people are leaving churches. They're changing political alliances. They're doing a lot, and there's a lot of ferment. So it's a good time to be out starting new things that
Absolutely
are more aligned with the times, perhaps than some of the legacy. I'm a big believer in not abandoning legacy institutions, but I also think we do need to build new things. And it looks like you kind of caught lightning in a bottle there, at least for now.
It seems that way. I think it's good to be a man like Nan and I seem to be decent at catching waves and surfing them. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't create the wave, but I know how to surf one. And we were at the right place at the right time. We're kind of early. And a lot of the male podcasts that are out right now in the Christian world was, we encourage those guys to start that stuff. Because take like Eric Kahn. He's got I think a smaller podcast than we do.
The Hard Men podcast.
Yeah. And Eric has produced some really, really quality episodes, right? And the things that I would never do. It's just not my personality type, but I know they've been really helpful to people. Like he did a podcast that reviewed Wild at Heart. And it was, this guy, Eric's good at coming at it in a balanced way, and it's just different. So those ministries are out there, and we kind of want to do our own thing. I'm trying to bully Nan into doing a podcast on like symbology or something. I think it's really fascinating.
It's not a question of bullying me. I've already agreed to do it with Canon. It's just a question of getting the content out there. I don't even know where to start.
Into actually doing it, But now, and I've done that slightly by saying it on this, that Nan has agreed to do a podcast, and therefore
there you go. Breaking news. Yeah. There you go. Well, again, gentlemen, thank you so much for taking, now 2 hours out of your day to talk about your new book. I really appreciate it. Best of luck with it. Again, the book is called It's Good to Be a Man by Michael Foster and Tennant, and it is available on Canon Press very soon. And again, sign up for the guys' newsletter, visit them on Twitter. And again, don't forget to hit the subscribe button on YouTube if you haven't already. Appreciate it, everybody. Thanks for listening.